Welcome. I will probably talking quite a lot. That's sort of my tendency, especially if I'm standing in front of an audience. So I invite you to interrupt me or to ask questions or to jump in. It might mean I'm not getting to the end of the slides that I have prepared, and that doesn't really matter. Yeah, so I'm very happy to focus more on the actions. If something comes to mind that you would like to raise or like to discuss, please feel free to do so. I start with my journey because that has brought me, in a way, that's brought me to the topics of paradoxes. And it also gives you a bit of insight about my background. So my first step into my professional life was a degree in architecture and town planning. And that was sort of a compromise gone wrong, which I realized pretty quickly. What stayed with me from that one, though, is an interest in the bigger picture as well as the details, which for me, architecture, sort of that's what it is about. As I felt I needed some different tools, I wanted to change direction. I then actually came here, left Germany and went to the UK. So I'm originally from Kiel, from the north of Germany. And in 1990, I went over to the UK to do my MBA to acquire a new tool set, because I felt the tool set I had wasn't really allowing me to do what I really enjoyed doing. And I didn't really know what I was going to enjoy. And when I realized that project-based work is really where my passion lies, and around design management, and new product development as I defined it at the time, I then went back to London Business School to do my PhD there. And my PhD was, the title of which was the effects of context and complexity in new product development. And very quickly that brought me away from looking at new product development as a standalone activity to realizing that if I really want to understand why things do or do not happen and why they succeed or not succeed, I really need to understand the bigger context. And so that brought me into innovation. And I got really excited about innovation. I was sort of one of those people jumping up and down and saying, everyone needs to be more creative and innovative. And, we all need to be creators and innovators. And then pretty soon I realized that probably will not work for a number of reasons. Because some of us just don't like that kind of stuff. Some of us just don't like the ambiguity and the risk-taking that comes with it. And also, while the organizations were all saying we really want innovation, at the same time they were really struggling. Please come in. Absolutely fine. They were at the same time they were struggling, because they had a different focus, and that's sort of the realization around the fact that we need diversity, and that's one of Darwin's finches. That tells us the story that there is great value in diversifying and finding a different niche with your skill sets. So while we need diversity, I also felt that when I was trying to understand the challenges around innovation, I realized that there is a conflict, a paradox, between whether organizations should focus on operational excellence or whether they should focus on innovation excellence. And anyone perceive that it is not a conflict? Anyone thinks, where is the problem with that? Just checking in. So because otherwise, if I continue think, so what's you going on about? There is no problem in the first place. Okay, so paradox. First of all, definition, and I'm just using a very simple one, which is a paradox is a statement or concept that contains conflicting ideas. So very simple definition. And if you think about your work life, is there anything that comes to mind which you in your work perceive to be a paradox? Sort of where you think, oh, I should do this, but I should also do that. Anyone experience these kinds of things? Yes? Yeah. Can you name a few? Sort of do some particular come to mind?
Do more with less.
Yeah. A very popular one, right? A very popular one, absolutely. Do more with less. Yes. Any others?
Conflict between exploration and exploitation.
Yes, absolutely. Do we want to explore things, try out new stuff, or do we want to mine what we've got already? Absolutely. Yes. Okay. So then maybe the question arises: why do I think that now is a particularly pertinent time to start thinking about paradoxes. So what is it in today's context that makes paradoxes become more obvious, to come more to the surface? And I think for me, one of the biggest drivers of the context in which we operate today are the challenges to humanity that we face. So on the one hand, we are basically very successfully poisoning the three elements that we rely on: the soil, the air, and the water. We are facing challenges that in itself sometimes pose a paradox, such as people dying of starvation and the challenge of obesity. We are facing further challenges of social injustice right next to each other. We are facing resulting challenges of aggression, a war, and terrorism, which I think for those of you who come from America is particularly pertinent right now. And of course, then all of these things combined lead to the undeniable, even though some politicians might think otherwise, some undeniable climate change. So this is one of the core conditions that is sort of pertinent for me in the 21st century. And there are a couple of other ones. This scenario we have created because of this, which I assume many of you will be familiar with. Who's familiar with this chart from the WWF? No? Well, on this chart, WWF have mapped the number of resources consumed, conglomerated at a national level, so per country. And they've mapped that against the Human Development Index, i.e., what is the mortality, infant mortality rate, education, these kinds of things. And as you can see, there are blobs all over the place, and each blob represents a country. And would you like to guess the two blobs down here?
Is that what the axes are?
So this is the Human Development Index, i.e. sort of, how advanced, we would call them developed and less developed countries. And on this axis is basically the footprint of that country, i.e. how much resources are used per person in that country, amalgamated at the country level. Is that?
The size represents the population?
Yes, and yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so the blobs represent the size of the... That's probably a giveaway then for what these two are? China and India, absolutely, yeah. And so basically, if you buy into the argument that it might be fair if everyone on this planet had the access to the same amount of resources as everyone else, then there's one place on this chart where all countries should be, which is the little green box down here. There is an interesting absence of any country being in that particular place. There used to be a country that was quite close to the green box. Anyone idea which one that might have been? No, Cuba. Cuba, because Cuba invested heavily in education and health, and they just didn't have very much consumption at all. So they used to be here, but of course now they've gone out. The big red one up there. Yes, and it says when they created this graph, which was already, of course, 6 years ago, they were saying that if everyone wanted to live and consume like the people in the United States, we would need 4 planets Earth by 2020. So this is another thing that for me really shapes the conditions of the 21st century. And of course, one of the challenges is that the tendency of nations is not to come down this way. The tendency of nations is to go like that. So there's only one direction. So that's the second aspect. And basically, it's driving the first one, the challenges that we face. Then there's another aspect that I'd like to share, which is basically a graph that looks at the rate at which change has been introduced over time. And it looks at a number of different aspects. Some of them are centered around technology, one is around human awareness, one is around leadership assumptions. And you can see that for a long period of time, the graphs have moved nicely in parallel in sort of a fairly gentle linear fashion, and that's for 4,000 years. And then something happened around the turn of the millennium that facilitated that the rate of change at which change is being introduced is exploding exponentially. One guess what? Exactly. One guess what it is? The internet. Absolutely. So it is basically the connections. The connections that the internet facilitates that make it possible for anyone to connect with anything, which sparks off, more things, and change is disseminating much faster than it has ever before. Yes. Yes, and also that gives me an opportunity to mention the thing that I've just jumped over, which again I find really quite interesting because can I just move this because I do like to walk. Oops, heavy. Because otherwise I might have pushed it over already, I guess. Okay, so you might have noticed that this red line is picked out in a different color, and the graph is from a book called Complex Adaptive Leadership, so it's all about leadership. And hence there's also this line which is about leadership assumptions, i.e. the way we think about leadership, what we consider to be the most appropriate leadership. And that's changed a little bit over time. But the way we think about leadership continues in one direction, whereas everything else seems to go in a different direction. So it's another presentation around that challenge. I just like to, yes, point it out.
What is meant by human awareness?
So basically, well, a very, very simple example is when I grew up, there was sort of one lot of milk on the shelf, and I didn't ask any questions about it. When I go into the shop today, I've got 20 different varieties of milk, and all have got different implications. So I know that when I buy organic milks, the animals that have produced that milk will have been treated differently from the one that are produced by non-organic milk. I know that when I buy almond milk, it's got different implications again. So it is just we are becoming aware of more things. I mean, I just think, generally when I go shopping, 20 years ago, or maybe even 15 years, or even 10 years ago, I would go to the shop and see some strawberries and think, oh, how lovely, I'll have some. Today, I will look where are they actually from, and what are the implications if I'm buying these. That's that kind of thing. It is basically so the amount of change that is being introduced. So a step change in awareness would be a change that has been recorded, and the introduction of a new technology, of changes in technology. I wouldn't say necessarily it is related with radical innovation, but certainly with innovation in a broader sense. Yeah, so I mean, we could stop here and use just that chart for the rest of the discussion. I'm in principle, I'd be open up to that, but I actually like to focus on the paradoxes for today. Okay, so yes, that's the graph, that one, and again, it is facilitated by all the connectivity that is possible. When I did my PhD, I spent days and days and days in the library, reading up journals and asking for articles to be sent through, which would take a couple of weeks before they'd arrive. If you ask a student today, when have you last been in the library, they probably look at you slightly puzzled. Or if they go to the library, it's certainly not to look up an article in a printed journal and then wait for another couple of weeks before the next one arrives. So this connectivity has made all sorts of, the fact that we are here together, the fact that I was able to join the team meetings in the preparation for the week here, it is all due to the connectivity. And so for me, one of the implications is this increased rate of change is really that in the past, we might have felt that wherever you are on a curve like this almost looks like it is linear. And so this is the world of the last century, where we felt wherever we are, if you look forward and backward, it looks pretty straight. And this enabled us to make the predictions because the rate of change was such that we were able to make these predictions. And if we didn't go too much in the future, they would probably hold true. What we are facing in this century is something more like this. The rate of change is just so fast that you can no longer believe in linear predictions. It just doesn't work like that anymore. It is becoming impossible. And I think the advancement in physics, particularly so quantum physics, the knowledge we have from quantum physics, which is sort of captured slightly humorously in this graph, is that if we are going below the smallest atoms into subparticles, we are basically facing a situation where we can no longer say with certainty where that little particle is. We only have got probabilities. Certainty is gone. And very often, like this thing, I don't know whether anyone knows about Schrödinger's cat. It's basically, the argument goes that unless you observe whether the cat is dead or alive, you just don't know. You know, so there's this huge amount of uncertainty. And by the way, the other thing that I particularly like about this quantum physics bit is that little particle where you're not quite sure where it is literally surrounded by nothingness. And what that means for me is that absolutely everything is connected. Which is quite nice, particularly when I'm traveling and my family is in a different place. Anyway, so again, I don't want to point this out. I don't want to dwell on this. I wanted to point this out because I feel that the observations and what is happening is mirrored in what we are learning in science. You know, this quantum physics, I think it is reflecting that. And so basically, for me, it leads to this paradox, you know, alive and dead, innovation and operating, these kinds of paradoxes. And you might, of course, say, you know, paradoxes, so what? Where's the problem? I think I can see at least two reasons why it is a problem for us to deal with paradoxes. The first one is that I believe that we are instilled with a mindset that makes us believe that there is one right way and a lot of wrong ways of doing things. And I think that is instilled in us very, very early in school. You know, when you are learning, there is one right answer, certainly at the very, very early years. And if you don't get this one answer right, oh gosh, you are stupid, aren't you? You haven't learned enough, you haven't gone fast enough. You know, how ridiculous, you're proposing a different solution, how ridiculous is that? So we are learning very early on that there is one right way, one right answer of doing things. And that is so deeply ingrained in our thinking that it takes a lot of effort to challenge that and to get it out of our way of thinking. So that for me is the first challenge, why paradoxes are a challenge. Because paradoxes are clearly about this or that. And if we believe there is one right way, we can only deal with one side of these things. And the second is somehow related, and that is how our brain actually works. This is a map of our brain where they've located where we store knowledge around certain things. And similar things are stored in close-by places. Our brain likes boxes. You know, so when I'm coming and encountering a creature on the street, I know whether it's a cat, a dog, or a human. So I don't have to think about and reflect and spend a lot of my brain's energy on understanding what I'm facing. It belongs in this box. Brilliant. I don't need to worry about it anymore. And so the fact that we like to think in boxes, for me, is another challenge to trying to deal with paradoxes. Because which box does it belong into? And our brain says, no, I don't like that. You go either in this box or that box, otherwise I can't deal with you. So I think there are certain reasons why paradoxes are indeed a challenge. And so how do we make sense? I'm just showing you a couple of images. And just sort of notice, just observe yourself, just notice how long it takes you to make sense of what you see. So this is the first one, if it comes up. Yeah, pretty straightforward, right? Now what about this one? Right, so what makes more sense to you, the colors you see or the words that you read? Yeah, I guess that will depend whether you're a visual person or a verbal person. You know, a lot of us are more focused around words. And so, but what our brain thinks, well, hang on a second, what's going on there? Yellow, blue, green, what's going on here? Right? And so the reason that our brain has boxes has got to do with efficiency. You know, so we don't need to figure out how things work, we just know we can put it in a particular box. So, I think that the 21st century makes us, or confronts us with a number of paradoxes, and I will share some that I can see in a moment. I think that we have, by who we are as human beings, we it is not easy for us to embrace paradoxes. And at the same time, if we are looking at the challenges we face, I believe that we need to find a way to actually learning and how to embrace these paradoxes. So what are some of the paradoxes that I can see? I think sort of particularly in the context here, one of the most obvious ones for me was sort of, we need growth and we need sustainability. And very often, I mean, who sees that as a contradiction? Yeah, so it is, growth, at least as understood today, means the consumption of more resources in some shape or form. And so how can that be sustainable if we've only got a limited number of resources available to us? And the nice thing about humanity is that once we identify a problem, we also start to develop some solutions. And just like to share 3 of the tools that I think help us get on the way of starting to embrace this paradox. And the first one is the circular economy, basically, which states, and apologize if I'm preaching to the converted, just in case someone doesn't know. I don't want to make assumption that everyone knows it, so I just very briefly state it, and it can follow up if you've got questions around it. So circular economy is all about trying to make as sure as possible that any resources you put into the production cycle stay in the production cycle, and that you minimize the amount of resources that have to leave the cycle and basically just be buried in the ground, which we do with so much stuff today. And of course, if you want to embrace the circular economy, you need to think from the outset. You need to have this holistic approach to think from the outset what will happen right at the end of the cycle and start designing for sustainability from the outset. It's not something you can tack on once you've combined materials. You can't uncombine them anymore. It's unless you've screwed them together or found ways that you putting them together that you can separate them at the end of it. Now, who's come across the concept of the donut economy? A couple of you have heard about it. Yeah, so you might say donut economy sounds quite yummy, right? Well, I think it is really yummy. So the donut economy is being developed by. Oh, by the way, I meant to mention that the first talk about the circular economy started in 1966. And sort of, I think it took off at a slightly larger scale when McKinsey and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation published a report in 2012. I think that's when it entered the wider awareness a little bit more. But so the donut economy is a concept developed by a British lady called Kate Raworth, because she said, even if we're living in a circular economy, I can still see some challenges around that. And so why she's developed the donut economy is she said, well, we've got 2 boundaries in which we need to try to stay. And the lower boundary is basically social justice, so that everyone has got a minimum viable economic life, well-being. And the upper boundaries are the boundaries of our planet. There's only so much we have available to us. And so we need to stay within these 2 boundaries. And when I thought about it a little bit more, I felt that actually there are some tools out there that are really helpful. And the next concept is that of natural capitalism. Familiar with natural capitalism? Yes, no? So for those, basically this is a book from 1999, and the authors are Hawkins and Amory Lovins. And basically what they said, if we want to find a way towards sustainability, these 4 principles will help us. And just very briefly, the first one is the radical resource productivity. And so basically, if we are using something, make sure we are using it to this optimum potential. And the example I like to use here is when we're having a shower, I mean, who does not like a nice, strong shower that lasts forever? And of course, that is hugely water consuming. And so several years ago, someone came up with the idea of injecting air jets into the water stream so that it feels like you've got a really great shower. But in fact, the water you lose is sort of 30-40% less. So that's the first principle. The second principle is biomimicry, learning from nature. And one of the most powerful examples that I have come across is that air condition, particularly in hot or cold countries, is one of the hugest costs in running a building. And so Arup, in collaboration with some of their partners, have decided, so is there anything in nature where the temperature on the inside is constant while the temperature on the outside fluctuates highly? And they found it in a termite mound. And so they analyzed the design principles of the termite mound and applied those to a building with the effect that the energy consumption went down by 90%. That's not 19, but 90. And so by saying, what can we learn from nature? And there's, of course, a website, Biomimicry 3.0. And the first time I thought 3.0, I've heard of Industry 1.0, and now we're at 4.0, 3.6. But of course, planet Earth has had 3.6 billion years to perfect the designs that we find in nature. So probably we can learn something from that. The third one is about servitization, which is selling services instead of products, like Rolls-Royce leasing their engines rather than selling them, which has the beauty that if anything goes wrong, it's their cost, they need to sort it out. So designing to the best possible performance in the first place is in their own interest. Reducing, and they retain and they keep owning the resources that have gone into the engines. And the last one is probably the most difficult to embrace, is reinvesting in natural capital. Basically, when we deforest areas, the consequences of that, both environmentally and socially, are huge. For example, the floods that we've seen in China a couple of years back basically were a consequence of deforestation and redirecting rivers. And so it's sort of to reinvest. And I believe that if we are really applying these ones, we can start to move in this direction. And by the way, all of these are tools for innovation. This one is more cost reduction. This is about, this one's about proving things. This is creating different things. So, you can really use these for principles to drive innovation or support innovation anyway. So that's the first, and I think one of the most challenging paradoxes, because if we want to address this one, we need to rethink all aspects of the system that currently sustain the mindset of growth. The next one, also one close to my heart, is around operating versus innovating. Do you see that as a conflict? Sort of putting that against each other? Well, I think sort of for me, the reason I see it as a problem is that if we are looking at what maintains operational excellence and if we are looking at what maintains innovation excellence, they are two different things. So what I felt that for a while, organizations felt they could alternate. It was called sorting out my house, becoming more efficient, streamline what we are doing, and once we are done that, we can embark on another drive for growth. Right? So let's focus on one and let's focus on the other. And I think that's just no longer possible. It's not possible to do that. And the biggest challenge is that what makes this one succeed in terms of mindset, structures, and everything is very different from what makes innovation succeed. And so this is where the greatest challenge to embrace this paradox of operational and innovation excellence lies for me. It's in the different mindsets, structures, people that are associated with really successfully doing one or the other. And it was really, really lovely moment when I realized that we do have a solution to that. And that solution, well, actually, I've got one quote about the problem with ambidexterity first. Ambidexterity, ambidexterity being equally well to do something with either hand. And there's Kostas Makidis is a professor at London Business School who's written this book, who basically pointed out what I've just described. And actually, I'm pretty sure some of you might have seen this before, but I can never resist testing my audience's ability to be ambidextrous, to do two things at the same time simultaneously well. And as we are in the morning, I assume you're all awake. It's not after lunch where you could argue, I'm too sleepy, I can't do that. So I think you're all awake enough to do this little exercise, right? It only takes a couple of minutes. Okay, and again, I'm saying, I'm pretty sure several of you will be familiar with this little exercise, so, don't tell the score. What I'm showing you in a moment is a very short video of a group of a couple of students. And what these students do instead of studying is they play with a ball. And I can see people nodding. I'm sure, I hope there are some people who don't nod, because otherwise the fun's gone. And so there are two teams, and the challenge is each of the teams has got a ball with which they play. And I've just said, I know that you are probably all pretty awake, but I'll make it a little bit easier. I ask you to focus on one team. You just need to focus on the white team, so they've got white tops or dark tops. And so you only need to focus on one of the teams with the white tops. And I would like you to do two things. I would like you to count the number of times the white team bounces the ball on the floor. So how many times does the ball of the white team touch the floor? And how many times does the ball, or is the ball of the white team being passed on to another member of the white team? So at the end of this exercise, all I want from you is two numbers. Number of times it's touched the floor, and it's not mean, not really. And the number of times it's been passed on, right? Are you up for that? Because I mean, it's not even a minute, I think. Okay, ready? Okay. Almost done. Okay, so how did you do? How many times did the ball of the white team touch the floor? 10? Okay. Okay, so say again. So we've got anything between 6 and 11? Okay. And how many times was the ball passed on? 14? 11? Yeah. And how many of you who have not seen this before have seen? Yeah. So how many have not seen it before? And how many of you have seen the gorilla? Not bad.
I actually only seen the gorilla.
So those of you who have not seen the gorilla, how do you feel right now? Yeah, sort of really like, what is all this about? I'm just, honestly, there is no gorilla in this video, right? And so I think again, I'd just like to show it because. I will show it to you again so you can now, if you don't focus, you will be able to see the gorilla. So as soon as you start counting, you're so concentrating on what you are doing, you just don't see anything else, which of course is one of the challenges we face with innovation. And it is also part that drives our problem with the paradox. We just very much better at focusing on one thing than lots of different things. And so just to show you again, there we are. So what I've done, I've tried to make you concentrate really hard. And of course, that's what we are supposed to do at work anyway, concentrate really hard on what we are doing. Yeah, so the gorilla doesn't only walk on, he stands center stage beating his chest, right? and still we don't see it. So, it is this is really, we need to learn to understand on how to overcome the challenges our brain poses. Because, we are very good at focusing on stuff. We are very good at focusing on one thing. And so therefore doing these two different things at the same time is really, really hard. So if we then start to think on how can we bring operational and innovation excellence closer together, one way of perhaps also doing, in addition to the awareness that we might have preferences that lean to one or the other way, and of course anywhere between the spectrum. Another way to perhaps look at this is to look at innovation not as one particular thing, and we've already heard radical innovation coming up, but as an entire landscape. There's an entire landscape of different types and levels of innovation. And if you think what operational excellence is about, a lot of operational excellence is about continuous incremental improvements. It's not that that operational excellence stands still. If you look at what operational excellence today looks like versus 5-10 years ago, it will have changed. And so if we understand that there is not really operational excellence or innovation excellence, but it's really part of a spectrum, then I think it might lose some of its feeling threatening to the people who are really good at this one here versus the people who are very good at this stuff up there. Because I think, coming back to it, a lot of it is that whoever is very great here is very different from who's very great up there. And as we prefer to surround ourselves with like-minded people, that tends to be conflict between them. And so instead of seeing operational innovation excellence as opposite ends of a spectrum, it becomes a continuum with different people who have different contributions to make at different points in time. By the way, this was the moment where I started loving innovation even more, because it means that everyone has a role to play. And moving away from the view of innovation, it is about the light bulb moment and about the crazy ideas and about the few people who are inspired enough to have the light bulb moment. It's just sort of on different places on the map. And so therefore, of course, then the challenge shifts. It doesn't really go away. It becomes a different challenge. And the different challenge is, how do I get these different people with these different mindsets to actually work together? Because they have different values, which means they probably argue a lot. If you put someone down here who's got a very detailed focus with someone who's got a great vision, it's really hard for them to communicate, because different things are important to them. And so for me, the solution is this kind of diversity, that you need birds of all feather in order to succeed and in order to bring operational innovation and excellence together. And then there are tools, and I know one of those is being used in this organization. Is it being used for everyone? No? But there are tools out there that help understand diversity. And even though it looks like putting people into boxes, it is not quite that, because when you do these things, you get scores in the different quadrants, and their scores vary. And you might get a person who's got their score fairly evenly distributed around the boxes. You might have some people who've got a very high score in one particular box. So it helps understand our own strengths and preferences better and those of others. And what I think is most important, it creates a language in which we can communicate. So, I don't have to say, oh, Jesus always got these crazy ideas, which sort of seems to be a little bit, just go away, I don't like you. But you can say, where would you put the visionary? Thinker? Yeah, it would be, I'm not that familiar with it, hence my question to those who know it. So basically, if you put the thinker and the doer together, already in the words you can sense a certain tension. And if you've got a language around that, you can, a lot of the tension goes away, because it does become less personal. It's not like you are this silly person, but you've got a certain skill set that is appropriate maybe in a different context. There's another one that I particularly like that's just been developed recently. The reason I like it so much is because it brings mindsets and process steps together, because it really can take you through the entire journey of, what is your skill set, where you're good at, are you sort of a visionary with a great deal of curiosity? Then we will listen to you most at the outset of something. If you are someone who is very good at implementing, then we might listen to you most if we are coming to that step. So again, it is about creating language that allows us to appreciate everyone with what they have to contribute. And I think then the awe between the innovation and operational excellence can disappear. The third one, and you will be pleased to hear that the other ones I'll go through a little bit quicker, because I feel that sort of for me, the growth and sustainability and innovation and operational excellence are some really, really critical ones for us. Another one I can see is basically that on the one hand, we seek stability, and on the other hand, we know we also need to change. And so one of the questions for me is not whether or not we need to stay still or whether we should change. It is more about a question of what and why should stay the same and should change. And in a way, for me, it might be sort of very simplistic, but I think quite effective way of trying to figure out what needs to stay the same and what should change is by going, by working back from the future. If I know where I want to be at some point in the future, that will help me understand that when hindsight, don't we all say hindsight is a wonderful thing? And working back from the future is a little bit of creating hindsight in advance. So if you project yourself into the future and then you look back and say, if this is where I want to be, what do I need to let go of today? What do I need to do more of today? What do I need to in addition? And so that helps to understand what should stay the same and what should change. And if you're then able to do it at the systems level rather than at sort of individual aspects, I think then you've got a fair chance to figuring out what you need to do. Another one that I absolutely love is, do you think about competition and collaboration as a paradox? The question is, shall we compete or shall we collaborate? And again, the question, it's not an absolute. It is in which context, in which situations, and for what reasons might we want to prefer collaboration over competition? And again, if you go back to the context of the 21st century, I believe that if we want to be able to solve any of the challenges that we are facing, we will not be able to do that via competition. That's why I find nothing more disheartening and frustrating than England leaving the EU. And Trump standing up and saying, just close your borders and make your country strong. Just really? In the context where everything is connected? How do the cybersecurity will not stop at boundaries, will not stop at political systems. The world in which we are living is connected to such a degree that we cannot just say, no, but this is mine. You can't have it or you can't be part of it. And so in terms of what it means on the organizational level, it might sometimes feel like having to offer up your crown jewels. But very often by offering up your crown jewels, you are able to enter collaborative partnerships that you would have never had before, that open up new markets that you would never had before. Because after all, innovation happens when you connect different bodies of knowledge. Innovation does not happen if you stay in your little pot and expect magical things to happen within that little pot. And you're probably heard of organizations such as Innocentive or 9 Sigma, basically those open innovation matchmaking platforms. And from the insights they have generated, we know that if you have a very tricky problem, if you've got a great challenge, the answer is not very likely at all to come from within that industry. Because when we are experts, we know what does and doesn't work. And so anything that is sort of outside the ordinary, we can't even imagine. And if someone suggesting there was a gorilla there, we need to pay attention to that. Unless you've seen the gorilla, you will say, well, yes, go away. This is absolutely crazy. I think you need a break. So maybe that's a way of getting an extra break is by saying, I've seen lots of gorillas. Anyway, so I think there are lots of good arguments, and I think it is also possible. Another way of achieving collaboration is if you look at the conundrum that the planet and humanity and everything on the planet is in, if you say sort of where can my organization contribute to addressing some of these? That's something, for example, something Nike had done when they came up before they came up with the what was it called? The wristband. They were the first one to introduce the Fitbit, thank you, yes. They were the first ones to come up with that, because when they had to look in the mirror after the sweatshop debacle and the problems the publicity they were facing, they had to take a step back and say, actually, what are we doing? What are we about? What do we stand for? And that motivated them to say, what do we have to offer that will address some of the challenges that humanity is facing? And so motivating people to become fitter was what they identified. And of course, in order to develop this Fitbit, was it really Fitbit? Was it not? Yeah, Fuel Band. Thank you. Yes, the Fitbit was the next one. the next one who came up is, yes, fuel band, exactly. The fuel band. So in order to realize that idea that they felt connected strongly what they stood for with their purpose, of course they had to collaborate with people they had never collaborated with before, you know, with software designers, with electrical engineers and all the rest of it. And the interesting thing, as a consequence of this fuel band, of course, a lot of data was generated. And what they then found, they found that insurance companies were approaching them to collaborate to get that kind of data. So it opened up entirely different collaboration opportunities, potential, creating new markets that did not exist before. So I think it can be really powerful if you try to elevate it to what is the higher purpose, where can we contribute. Two more I'd like to share. For me, one of the consequences of this increased connectivity and the challenges and all the rest of it is that the context in which we live in the 21st century is so much more complex than anything before. And that also was reflected in the shallow curve, where you can assume that you are living in a linear world, and the one where it's sort of fluctuating so much there's no hope in hell that you can still believe it is linear. And so actually I believe very strongly that the world we live is a highly complex one. And why does that matter? Well, first of all, I think it is really important to differentiate between complicated and complex. And the reason why that is so important is that if I'm studying something that is as complicated as this, I can understand it. I can understand how it has behaved in the past, and what is most important, I can use that knowledge to predict how that system will behave in the future, and I can influence how that will behave in the future. If I'm having a complex system, I can still study it, and I still might understand how it got to where it is. But trying to predict on where it will go next becomes literally impossible. And so this is the context that we are facing. And one of the things on how to thrive in a complex context is not to rush around like mad, but to move slowly and observe what is happening. Because when we are rushing around, we just don't notice what's happening around us. You know, this is why motorways are so much wider than sort of roads that are restricted to 40, 50, or 60 kilometers per hour. Because you just can't react as fast anymore, so you need more space, more safety around it. And so if you want to notice what's going on, you need to move slower. And of course, when something doesn't work, we tend to work faster, not slower. So that in itself is a paradox, this paradox of needing to slow down in order to speed up. And I feel that, at least for a while, Apple was managing this really well. Most technology companies produce new model after new model after new model in such short periods of time, that from my side as a consumer, basically I'm trying to hold on to my existing technology for as long as I possibly can, because I haven't got a clue based on what criteria I should choose a new one, because things are just changing so fast. And I felt that for a while Apple was really good at having a really big step change, and it was very clear what was new and different. And of course, I think Apple completely lost the plot as well, because they are now, like everyone else, producing these incremental improvements constantly, and they're announcing it as a big step change. That's even worse. However, the other reason why I've chosen Apple here is that when the iPhone first came out about just over 10 years ago, it was very simple on the surface. And it had all the complexities hidden behind it. So from a user perspective, it was really simple. Everyone could use this almost without instructions, same with the iPad. But behind it was a huge degree of complexity. And so a way for me to embrace this paradox is to make the best possible effort to understand the complexity that lies underneath, and that is there, and then trying to reflect that onto the surface, which is really quite simple and easy for people to understand. And then there's a final one, and that is about the paradox of versus mind versus heart. We always hear about what rational beings we are. We all make rational decisions, do we? I'm very pleased to hear you say that, because I don't think, and even in organizations, I don't see that. You know, we are collecting all this data to support our decision making. Yet I've observed time and again, if the data doesn't agree with the person, what the person wants to do, for some reason that data disappears. Or it's, you know, oh, it's not valid, or it's not enough, or, you know, whatever the reason for discrediting the data might be. And so for me, one way of solving this challenge is to stop pretending. I mean, I heard from the room, a lot of you agree that we are not. But I think in the business context, we are less likely to accept that, because also we have to justify our decisions and all the rest of it. And I just truly believe that if we would accept that our emotions deeply influence and affect the decisions that we make, be they personal or professional, if we would allow that, acknowledge that, I believe our decisions would become more rational as a consequence, because we are not trying to cover it up. And so I also think that to really succeed in an organization, you need to be able to combine the hearts and minds of the people. And now I'm just sort of referring to the statistics. It was a Gallup survey from 2008, where they basically found that 70% of all turnover could be avoided if basically people felt more seen and heard and embraced in organizations. Because it's sort of, you know, they are reduced to numbers. You know, we're talking about human resources like, you know, our raw materials and all these things. And if it comes to redundancies, we're talking about, you know, reducing the numbers and things like that. So I just thought it was quite an interesting statistic. And after all, as Einstein said, and again, I prefer to read the quote because it's not one I constantly use, so it's not so in my mind. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And so I think if we can allow our mind and heart to play together, we will achieve better results as if we are keeping it separate. And so for any of the paradoxes, I believe it is like looking at a distant star. If you try to look right at it, you can't see it. But if you sort of look to the side of it and find a different way around it, you can all of a sudden see it. And I think so when we are looking at paradoxes, if we are trying to take a slightly different perspective on it, different angle of it, look a little bit to the side of what we perceive to be the paradox, then maybe we find a way to embrace them. Thank you.